Okay. So last time we were chatting, we were looking at this period of 1929 to 1945. We had talked about the impact of the Great Depression on job opportunities for women, some of the gains that had been made in the teens, especially with women being given the right to vote. There was a pushback. Men became resentful that their wives were working, that they had to work. We had marriages falling apart. Women were constrained from what jobs they could do. We found that we talked about that even though women were more and more often asked or forced to get into the workforce, they didn't have to give up any of the traditional roles that they still maintained in their households that they didn't gain greater power. They may have done, research suggests they did better psychologically than the men, but they found it difficult to assert rights, perhaps even more so than ever. So let me switch to presentation mode, and then I'm going to share my screen with you, and we will continue with this idea that we were discussing during the during this period. Oh, now I lost the presentation again. I'm running a little late today because my grandkids' school is closed, and so my kids asked if we would help out. We're happy to do so, especially since my wife and I have been able to get vaccinated. My mother-in-law's building had extra doses, and they let some family members who were there at the end of the day, rather than toss the I don't want this screen shared. Rather than toss the doses, they here we go. Okay. All right. So let's talk about one of the outgrowths that we see during this crisis years. Is what I want to call the beginning of building a welfare state. All right. Perhaps some of you have recollections of this period. I kid my wife. Sometimes I say you grew up in the Great Depression, the way you act and the way you sometimes hoard certain things. But Roosevelt comes to power in 32. Not much has been accomplished, and there was a lot it needed to do for the lives of Americans in general, but in particular for women. Roosevelt himself was encouraged, and he was prodded. He was pushed by his wife Eleanor, by Frances Perkins, and arguably he did more to improve the lives of American women than had been done in any prior administration. One of the first priorities of the incoming Roosevelt administration, the famous 100-day plan, the first priority was what they called the cradle to grave system of social insurance that women reformers had been advocating for since the turn of the century. So there was months and months of heated debate in Congress. A national system of health insurance was voted down because the American Medical Association so strongly opposed it. And just as an aside, what this shows us, we think the battles over Obamacare in 2009 were harsh. He wasn't the first to fight this battle. Roosevelt did. Truman tried to put in a national health plan. Clinton tried to. It's always been traditionally been opposed by doctors, by insurers. And so what they did, Congress did instead, they put in the system we have now for old age, for unemployment, care for the disabled, Medicare, Medicaid type programs. Congress also moved forward with the provision for aid to dependent children. A big help, we talked about last week, there was an increase of men abandoning their wives and children's divorces. So you had an increased number of women on their own with dependent children. So aid to them was important. And frankly, we see it's not so very different today. One of the underlying pushes for increasing the national minimum wage is if you make the current minimum wage, even if you have a full-time job, if you're a single parent, you can't feed your kids. You know, the people are pushing for this. One of the things they point out, in a sense, the federal government subsidizes companies like McDonald's and Walmart because they pay people minimum wage, they work full time, and they still need food stamps. You know, McDonald's and Walmart, in a way, can pay their workers, even though it's the federal minimum wage. They don't have to go above that because the federal government gives them food stamps. There was a big, I don't know if you remember, I digress and I'll get back on track. A couple of years ago, there's a big outcry. There were Walmarts across the country. It was reported that in their break rooms, there were baskets for employees to chip in to help other employees. And many people are like, really? You pay your employees so little that other employees have to step up and try and help them out? Anyway, back to the topic. Women's groups were particularly pleased with this aid for dependent children because it provided for essential financial needs of young children living in their own homes whose fathers were dead, that had deserted them, or were mentally or physically incapacitated. Social Security Act, which we all benefit from either currently or soon or at some point in the future, was another major achievement. When we talk about building a welfare state, it put the government on record as assuming a modicum of responsibility for the aged, the disabled, and the poor. You no longer counted on people to save, in the sense that what the Great Depression showed is there were many people who didn't have the financial wherewithal to care for themselves. You know, it's one thing to plan for retirement, at least talk about it. It's quite another thing to do it. And far too many people didn't have funds to take care of themselves in old age. There were, of course, some glaring defects in the quote unquote welfare state that Roosevelt was striving to put together. Southern Democrats put a lot of pressure on them. So the Social Security Act excluded agricultural and domestic workers, which in the South were two fields that were, no pun intended, dominated by blacks. They didn't want blacks to get these benefits. Payroll taxes were used to pay for old age benefits, were regressive. And I think we understand it. You know, especially when you have a cap on it. I think the current cap is something like, I don't remember exactly, but something like, let's say $115,000. Okay, so if you're working, 7.5% of your salary is set aside as a contribution to Social Security. Now, if I make $50,000 a year, that's a big chunk of money, 7.5%. If I make $500,000 a year, even though it's 7.5% on $100,000, it just has a bigger impact, right? Another problem, by the way, is as we all know, the Social Security Fund was supposed to be set aside and hands off. And the government during the starting in the Reagan era started raiding the Social Security Fund. So when you talk about the Social Security not having enough money and they have to make reforms because maybe there's estimates as early as 2030, there'll be no money to pay out. That's because the money that was supposed to be untouchable was touched and used for other things and never paid back. And of course, we all understand. I know for myself, if I spend 50 or 60 years paying out of my salary into fund, and when it's time for me to get my own money back, you say, sorry, we don't have your own money anymore. It's going to be a big problem. Anyway. So last thing that went into place when Roosevelt was trying to put these plans into effect, and you can see there was some strong disagreements with Congress. Congress differentiated between welfare programs such as aid to dependent children, which were paid out of general tax revenues, and social insurance such as old age pensions, to which workers contributed from their own wages. All right, so Congress was willing to pay to give food and aid to children, but said, if you're working, you've got to take care of yourself. Now, this distinction tended to stigmatize women and children who receive welfare as less worthy than the elderly who receive Social Security benefits. In other words, and it became worse and worse over the years. If you were a woman and you were a child, you were getting, it was seen that you were getting a handout from the government. If you were a senior citizen and you were getting money, well, you had contributed, your employer contributed, but you know, to expect a child to contribute, that doesn't make sense. To expect women who in this time were much more likely than they are today to be stay-home moms. So again, you had two groups that had no way of contributing, but they needed assistance. So it's just, you know, Reagan made this a big deal. In the 80s, he ran against the welfare queens, people perpetually on welfare. So I think you can appreciate the stigma that could go along with this. Now, making matters worse, these dependents, aid for dependent children, could be withdrawn if a mother could not satisfy a morals test. Okay, and you know, I think we all understand when you have something as ill-defined as a moral test, it sort of opens itself up for abuse. So in other words, a woman who set a bad example for her children, if she drank, if she didn't keep her home clean, or she quote unquote entertained men, okay, she could be denied benefits. The bill compounded difficulties for mothers by providing allowances for children only. So the mothers themselves received nothing. So again, if you had a woman who wasn't working, she might get some help for her kids, but not for herself. Now, despite frantic lobbying efforts by Margaret Sanger and others, the revival of a national system of maternal and child health services paid no attention to birth control. And I think you should be seeing by this point some of the issues and debates that went on in the 30s, went on in the 60s, and the 70s, and the 80s, and to some extent go on today. Right. There were more than moral objections involved when we talk about birth control. Politics played a major role regarding the issue, as FDR's Democratic coalition was dependent on Catholic support. And Catholics, as we know, oppose any form of birth control. Thus, while Eleanor Roosevelt served on Sanger's American Birth Control League in the 20s, she stopped discussing birth control publicly once FDR became a presidential contender in 32. So I'm going to throw out the question, and I think the answer should be obvious. You know, why was birth control so important to feminists? If you think about it, if you want to, as a woman, have a say in the direction of your life, have some control of your life, you need to have control of your body and especially reproductive systems. You know, if you can decide when you want to have a child and how many children you wish to have, you have much more freedom and flexibility in your life trajectory, whether you want to stay at home, whether you want to have a career, when you want to have a big family, when you want a small family, whether you want to start a family at 20 or 30. And so birth control is a key issue to women in general, I would say, and to feminists in particular. So ironically, and some might say not surprisingly, the government's biggest initiative with regards to birth control focused on the South. In 1937, North Carolina became the first state to offer birth control through its public health program. It was followed by South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, all states where there were few Catholics and many blacks. So there were no Catholics to oppose it, and the powers that be were happy to see fewer black children born. In the end, support for birth control came from fear of the rising cost of relief. Right? They thought, well, it's cheaper if we keep the poor people of color from having kids and having to help them raise their kids, because, and why would they have to help them, particularly in the South? Because they didn't let blacks hold certain jobs. They kept them the whole system of segregation. So when you hold them down and force them into a depressed financial situation where they can't feed their children, well, rather than step up and have to feed the children, say, oh, we'll help you have fewer children. Another major initiative that went along with the so-called welfare state was the National Labor Relations Act. And it was a bill that provided for the federal supervision of union elections. So the women reformers weren't so optimistic. They didn't have much confidence in this bill because when they dealt with big labor tended to be elitist, meaning they were snobbish when it came toward their attitudes towards the unskilled, which was often meant women and minorities. Still, progress was being made in the unionization of women as the new generation of labor leaders, typified by the head of United Mine Workers, John L. Lewis, fought in the tradition of the Wobblies to unionize whole industries. Now, unionization helped women because unionization would mean better pay, better hours, better benefits, things that women were not getting, especially in fields that were dominated by women, such as teaching. Again, I mentioned last week, I believe, that when you look at industries that were traditionally and historically dominated by women, they had low salaries, they had poor worker conditions. And so for women, the expansion of labor unions was a plus. Now, a good example is the automotive industry. Women made up 75% of the workforce. Electrical industry, women made up 25% of workers. In garment and textile industries, women predominated. So as a result, you had a new militancy on the part of unions, and they won some of the biggest gains of all. The Communist Party played a particularly important role in championing the cause of women workers. The Communist Party was very much a workers' party based on their philosophy and approach to things. So if you're championing the right of all workers, you would champion the right of women also. Now, let's be clear. The Communist Party, for all the Red Scare in the 50s, the Communist Party was never a major political force. It got 120,000 votes in 1932, but it did make significant contributions to industrial unionizing during the 30s, and it controlled about a third of the CIO by the end of the decade. So they were, I would say, more effective in targeted efforts like labor unions as opposed to national elections. And the party took women's contributions, not meaning money, but what they had to offer. They took it seriously. They found roles for women and heard women's voices. The wages of war. Let's talk about what happens with the outbreak of World War II. Now, we know World War II accomplished what no amount of political organizing could do in the 1930s. And I'll step back and say this also. The United States only fully emerged from the Great Depression because of World War II. Roosevelt's plan in 32, 33, 34 was making a big impact in turning the country around and getting the economy back on its feet. But it cost money. And the Congress panicked. And in 35 and 36, Congress insisted on passing balanced budgets. They wouldn't deficit spend, and it put the economy back into recession. And the economy only started robustly growing when we started preparing for war. By 39, Roosevelt had recognized, I think, that war was inevitable with Germany. He famously pushed through the Lend-Lease Act. We were prohibited by law from arming Germany's enemies in Europe, meaning France and Britain, because the United States in the 30s was very isolationist. But we had this Lend-Lease Act where we literally lent military equipment to the British, and they could, at the end of the lease, buy it if they wanted to. So you had some production increasing there. And of course, after Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor, overnight, the economy had to turn on a dime. So it not only boosted the economy in general, it ended the depression, as I said, but it created a critical labor shortage. You had hundreds of thousands of men either being drafted or enlisting, and suddenly you had a labor shortage. And so you had jobs that for for a decade or more, high-paying jobs women were not allowed to have. Suddenly they were open. Suddenly they needed people, and the only people available were women. Now, during the war itself, the number of employed women rose from 12 to $18 million. That's 18 million. It's a 50% increase. And the very government officials, employers, and union leaders who had once opposed hiring women were now celebrating the virtues of woman power. Right? So the best symbol I think we're all familiar with is Rosie the Riveter. Right? We've all seen posters like this. You know, this iconic poster, "We can do it." So Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon who, while fictional, she represented the American women who worked in factories and shipyards, many of whom produced munitions and war supplies. Real-life Rosies were seemingly everywhere. Women took jobs as taxi drivers, as bus drivers, as railroad workers, as lumberjacks, security guards, welders, and of course, riveters. The biggest jump in women's employment was in factory work, which claimed 2.5 million new workers, and especially defense work, where women's workforce participation grew by 460%. In defense plants, women worked on tanks, airplane frames, engines, propellers, parachute ships, gas masks, life rafts, ammunition, artillery, and electrical equipment. In other words, women were doing jobs that before the war, they'd say, a woman can't do it. She's not strong enough. She's not capable enough. She doesn't need to do it. And suddenly the women became indispensable. And so when you're looking, big picture about the change of status of women in the country, they're being allowed out of necessity to enter in the workforce in increasingly significant numbers. It changes the dynamic. Here's some pictures. This is a woman putting a propeller on an aircraft. Here are some riveters. I have to have some real life pictures of riveters, right? Women also made gains in white collar work. Many women, including most women with a high school degree or more, they preferred clerical work to factory work. Makes sense, right? Although the wages were not as high because the hours were shorter, the work was less strenuous, the conditions better, and the status higher. And frankly, I think if men were given the choice, many men would have made the same choice also. Women made smaller gains in the professions because of the extensive training required for most careers. In other words, if there aren't enough riveters, it doesn't take me so long to learn to be a riveter. There's a shortage of doctors. I can't take a 2-week course and start covering for doctors who are serving the military by performing their surgeries. But having said that, the war did open opportunities for women in fields such as medicine. Harvard Medical School admitted women finally in 1944, symphony orchestras, chemistry, and the legal profession. Okay, it's important to remember that the war went on for 4 years. It's a long time to go without certain professions. And so even those that needed training, they finally said, you know what, gotta let women do them. Now, the biggest and arguably most visible changes took place in the military. Most dramatic break from military tradition, the Army enlisted women into the military services in 1942. They created a Women's Army Corps, the WACs. Okay, great poster. This is my war too. I'd rather be with them than waiting. Okay, they needed women. And we see real life pictures of women in service. Soon thereafter, the other branches of the armed forces had their own female units. Most women served as clerical workers or nurses, but a few who had been trained as pilots before the war joined the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. Now, This is an ongoing debate to our time, whether or not women can serve in combat roles. But setting that aside for just a moment, even if women, all women could do is quote unquote be clerical workers in the 40s, it meant that you had more men who could then serve in actual battles. So, we can't overlook the contributions of a clerical worker, especially when the person filling that job would not be allowed to be on the front lines. If you say to me, well, he and she can both be in the front line, but we're just going to pick her, that's maybe not fair. But if she's not allowed to be in the front line by law, at least she's able to contribute. Getting back to the Air Force, these women who had been pilots before the war, they test flew new fighters to demonstrate how easily they were to maneuver, and they made 75% of all airplane deliveries throughout the US and Canada. So again, they may not have been allowed to fly combat missions at that time, but they served an important role because they freed up other people to fly to combat missions. By 1944, female nurses and doctors had won full officer status and recognition of their command positions over male corpsmen and patients. And for us in 2021, this is like, well, duh. But we're talking about the 40s. And so this is groundbreaking changes, even if they only occurred out of necessity of war. By the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of women had donned uniforms in the armed services and were earning equal pay with men holding the same rank, which is probably not true in industry in general. The war also brought women a significant boost in earnings. The median income for all women, adjusting for inflation, rose 38% during the war as employers competed for scarce workers. The biggest boost came to women who took advantage of the labor shortage by moving into better paying jobs. For example, 7 million women left their jobs and homes to migrate to cities in which defense industries were booming. Smart thing to do. Now, increased wages meant that many poor women were now able to provide adequate food for their families, some for the first time in their lives. The nutrition of the poorest third of the population came close to equaling that of the richest third by the end of the war. All right, let that sink in. All right, the differences in nutrition largely went away. For many women, expanded opportunities offered greater freedom than they had ever known. Margarita Salazar, the sheltered daughter of Mexican parents, entered a new world when she went to work at a Lockheed assembly plant in Los Angeles. For the first time in life, she mixed with Anglos. Okay, so you had gender barriers being shattered. You had barriers based on ethnicity being shattered. We all blended in, she recalled, men, women, Mexican, Italian. Not all women could take full advantage of these opportunities. Black women were able to recoup the losses of the Depression years by regaining domestic service positions and even winning jobs in laundries, cafeterias, and other commercial services as white women abandoned them for better paying jobs. Okay, so there were some barriers that didn't fall. So these Black women were able to catch up a little bit because the jobs they had lost to white women opened up because the white women got better paying jobs. It's not that the Black women could have gotten those better paying jobs. The Black women got the crummy jobs and the white women got better jobs. But things like jobs in war offices or stores or factories, they were hard. They were hard for Blacks to get, even with the creation in 1941 of the Federal Fair Employment Practices Commission. But despite the limitations, despite all the caveats that we've mentioned or could have mentioned, the war years represented a major shift for women. By 1943, there were practically no unmarried women left to draw on. The increase of the workforce after 43 came overwhelmingly from the ranks of unemployed housewives. For the first time in U.S. history, married women outnumbered single women in the labor force, and women over 35, once considered unemployable, outnumbered their younger sisters. And we'll see when the war ends, there's some pushback. Many women were expected to go back to being housewives. The men came back and wanted their jobs back. But once you open a door, and the door for women was open in a big way during World War II, it's impossible to close it completely. It's impossible to close it completely. The greatly expanded role for women in the workforce points more to the extent of the wartime crisis than to any fundamental redirection in employing patterns. Okay, it wasn't that employers suddenly came to the realization, women can be just as good at work as the men, maybe even better. Just like we need workers, women are the only people. So again, maybe some of these gains occurred for the wrong reason, but they occurred nonetheless. So the shift from young single women workers to older married workers was part of a long-term trend. Throughout the early decades of the 20th century, as women bore fewer children, kept those children in school longer, and strove to raise their family standard of living, they looked for opportunities in the workforce. So, it was a convergence of factors at play here. More women who were married wanted to work. And come World War II, you needed more women to work. As the economy gradually shifted from blue-collar and service work, women found opportunities even during the Depression, when public opposition to their doing so was especially high. The war accelerated this trend. It did not produce it. In some ways, the war reinforced traditional roles rather than imposed new ones. For instance, not the where, the war heightened men's images as warriors and protectors of defenseless women, while diminishing their supply through the draft. By 44, there were 2 women for every man in the 20 to 24 age group, and many young women began rushing to the altar out of fear that they might not otherwise marry at all. As these new wives rapidly became mothers, employers' primary source of cheap labor sharply diminished. Right? If you could hire single women cheaper, suddenly there's fewer single women. And making things worse, or making it harder to recruit people, many husbands, if not most husbands, remain strongly opposed to their wives working. In response to a 43 Gallup poll that inquired, would you be willing for your wife to take up a full-time job running a machine in a war plant? Only 30% of men said yes. Think how crazy that is. You're in the middle of a war. You're talking about not just any old job. You're talking about running a machine in a war plant. And only 30% said they would like their wives to work. So even at the height of the war, only 26% of all wives worked. And of those, the great majority had no children under 14. Okay. So there were social patterns and mores that were in place that were hard to fully overcome. And we'll take another generation or two before we saw those patterns begin to change in a significant way. If simple prejudice was not enough to ensure the perpetuation of traditional roles, the burdens of wartime housekeeping heightened the difficulty taking on new responsibilities. Under the double burden of domestic and work responsibilities, women sometimes had to quit or stay at home simply to buy food for the families, catch up on laundry, or care for her children during summer vacation. By the way, this is exactly what's been going on during the pandemic. When people were forced to work at home, and you're seeing a much higher dropout rate of women in the workforce, because Husband's got to keep working. If they're both home, someone's got to watch the kids because school's not open. So this pattern of the family responsibilities falling unequally, if not unfairly, upon the women is repeating itself with significant consequences, literally, as we speak. All this stuff explains why for every 2 women workers hired in the war production factories in June 43, 1 quit. Lack of proper childcare options was yet another impediment to women working. It's still an impediment to women working. Again, one of the major things we're finding families struggling with during the COVID pandemic with schools closed is who's going to watch the kids? And if you've got kids or your kids have kids at home, if you tried to work from home and have your kids do school by Zoom, it's not possible. You know, until August, when my 2 grandsons started back to school in a school that is open, one's in pre-K and one's in 1st grade, and they feel it's safe, and thank God everything's been fine. But I was watching my grandkids every day for 4 or 5 hours. The only way my daughter and her husband were able to work, because when I wasn't watching the kids, one or both of them couldn't work. By the end of the war, the country was providing childcare for only 1 in 10 of those who needed it, and yet the center remained only partially filled for few working mothers actually used daycare centers. Okay. Again, you know, there's a famous saying in Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, Ein chadash tachat hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun. So one of the things I've emphasized, and I think you'll see in the remainder of a discussion over the next couple of weeks about the history of the women's movement, same issues keep cropping up. Same issues. Some we've solved, and things like childcare for women who want to work, or for families where both parents have to work, is still a problem. Most mothers made other arrangements, usually by leaving their children in the care of relatives or neighbors. Has the challenge of childcare changed much? I think I've already answered that. It's easier, I think, to the extent it's less stigmatized, but also it comes down to resources. If you can afford a nanny or a sitter or a daycare center when your child's 2, you go back to work. If you've got a minimum wage job, an hourly job, and if you don't have a mother, a sister, somebody to watch your kids, you're in trouble. Women who overcame the problem of limited services to work in war industries found an additional problem: the hostility of male co-workers. Men in general resented the women whose arrival signaled the loss of their special status as craft workers. Again, we see that in certain industries to this day. Older men whose seniority let them take less strenuous jobs were particularly resentful because they had to return to heavier work so that women could be used in the physically less taxing positions. Right? And this is not a question of favoritism. It's practical. You know, if at 60 I can still lift more than a 30-year-old woman who's half my size, and the company's got both of us working, you're not going to make the smaller woman do all the schlepping if she can't physically do it. Now, if I haven't been schlepping for a while and at 60 years old, I think I'd be annoyed if I had to start schlepping again. It's just the reality of life. Further complicating matters were men's fears that employers would quickly see the advantage of employing women and paying them less, thereby putting men's future job security at risk. Now, today, legally, they can't, companies can't do this, even though it still happens. But it makes sense if you're a man. Wow, I know they're paying this woman half or 2/3 what they paid me. Wow, does that mean they're going to fire me and start hiring cheaper workers? I mean, the economics would say yes, do that. This concern prompted male union officials to side with women on the equal pay issue. Their theory was that women were inherently less productive than men, and that if employers had to pay them equal wages, managers would always prefer men. Right? So let's be clear. The unions weren't real in favor of expanding women's rights. They were trying to protect men's rights. And they guessed wrong because they assumed that women would be less productive. In certain industries, and in many cases, the women were as productive, not more productive than the men. So in a certain way, I suspect it backfired. So do you still think this is true today? Legally, it's not supposed to be true. But practically, it still happens. The excuse is maternity leave. If you look, for instance, in professions like the law, and my numbers can be off somewhat, but the general thrust of what I'm saying is true. Half, if not more, of current graduates of law school are women. And the percentage of women partners at major law firms is still small. I don't know the exact figure, but I'm pretty sure it's less than 20%. Now, part of the rationale given is, well, the partner track's so demanding, and women, if they're going to take off 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks to have their kids, it interrupts things. So maternity leave is cited as an issue. Or, well, women are going to work till they have kids and they'll take off a few years and come back. So they still find excuses. The statistic tracked by the government is women make about 3/4 on average of what men make. So most women working in defense plants accepted the view that their jobs were temporary and that veterans had a prior claim to higher paying jobs. Not unreasonable. It may have irked them, but you were home. The men went to fight the war. The men came home. The men wanted their jobs back. There is an argument of fairness to be made to giving them the jobs back. Quite simply, women did not expect or want the jobs at the expense of returning soldiers. Moreover, as the last hired, women could be expected to be the first fired. For a variety of reasons, when war production ended, women quit at twice the rate they were discharged. To many women, especially those who had been in the workforce before the war industry layoffs were crushing. Right? They finally achieved jobs that paid well. They wanted to hold on to what they gained. Their point was, I was working before the war. It's not fair that you take my job from me and give it to a soldier who's returning. Good for him. He defended the country, he helped defeat the Nazis, but I had a job before the war. I should have a job now. Yet even those who held on to their jobs saw their pay decrease. Specifically, 9 out of 10 women who kept their jobs experienced a decrease in pay from roughly $50 a week to $37 a week. Why? Think about it. Why? Because the businesses could, because they were women. So, we're seeing a mixed bag here. There were gains to be made, but not as many were lasting as the women of the time would have hoped. The impact of the war experience was mixed. For a small number of women, the war provided an opportunity for upward mobility, which they were able to hold on to after the war. However, for most, the crisis nature of the conflict ensured that traditional values would be reasserted once the fighting was over. By the end of the war, a Gallup poll revealed how little the war had changed things. Only 16% of all men and 20% of all women agreed that a married woman should work if her husband could support her. Okay? Moreover, the women's organization that had once fought on behalf of women's concerns were all but dead. As far as government support for women was concerned, the period 29 to 45 proved, on the whole, to be disappointing. The disappointment was that the gains were temporary. They weren't long-lasting. As for the significance of the war in drawing women into the workforce, it seems clear that the war gave millions of women a much broader appreciation of their capabilities. I mean, if you've never worked before and you find yourself doing whatever in a factory or an office, it had to be eye-opening. It had to be empowering. And it had to be very frustrating if at the end of the war you said, sorry, you're just a woman, go back home. Even those who ultimately left the workforce may well have passed the resulting boost in confidence to their daughters. Conversely, the fact that married women became the majority of all women workers during the war is not attributable to the war alone. Rather, the shift in the female workforce from young single women to older married women was part of a long-term transformation reaching back to the turn of the century. In short, the war did not dramatically change women's lives. Instead, its principal effect was to produce a sense of crisis, which made traditional family, with all its demands on women, seem more desirable than ever before. Right? So you can understand, so some women who were forced to do this, the men were away, and maybe their husband was in the war, so they're working and taking care of the kids. When they had a chance to go back to just being mom, they took it. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, let me be clear. And I say this in all sincerity. I think being a stay-at-home mom is about the toughest job I can think of. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, as I said, there were months I was watching my grandkids for 4 and 5 hours a day. And I was exhausted. It was hard, you know. So I get why some people thought doing that and working another job, I can only do one, not both. On the other hand, I could understand also, and this I think was the long-term trend that continues to our days. If you're a woman and you stay home while your kids are young, because they need you there on a daily basis, and they go to school, and you're home with nothing to do, not nothing, but you know, your kids leave for school at 7:30 and come home at 3:30. What do you do? It's a lot of hours in the day, right? There's only so much cooking or shopping or cleaning or Alta tennis you can do, or gym or Etsy, whatever it is. And so this trend of older married women, as their kids get older, want something more challenging, in the sense that when their children don't need them as much, this big outlet for their creativity and their energy and their passion has been curtailed, and they want outlets. Makes sense. So that was what I had to share with you today. Next time we're together, we will move to, I'll show you. Bear with me. I have too many windows open. The next period we're going to deal with is, I'm just double checking my notes. We're going to look at what I'm calling Feminism Reborn. This is the period 61 to 73, which is often thought of as the period of women's rights movement, and it dovetails and corresponds in a lot of ways with the push for civil rights, because we'll see that the women who are pushing for expanded women's rights were either very involved in the push also for civil rights, or they learned a great deal from their successes. All right, any questions or comments? All right, well, did this work better? Can you see better on the bigger screen? Shulami, was this better for you to see? Yeah. Yeah, this echo is still an issue, I think. And, you know, I've spoken to Lisa, and I hope they'll figure out a way that you can hear better, and then I can hear you, because I'd like to figure out a way until they let me back in the building, that we can have more give and take. Have you all had your 2 doses of the vaccine yet? Wednesday is your second? right. Well, good luck with that. I hope it all goes well. Lisa, again, until we can do live classes, I'd encourage you to figure out something to do with this echo, because I don't know if y'all hear it, but I hear it badly. Okay. All right. I will then echo off, and I'll speak to y'all in 2 weeks. Take care, y'all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Keep well.